In our last class, we talked about Constantine, his career, his conversion to Christianity, and what that conversion meant in a Roman world that was actively persecuting Christians at that moment. But to begin this story, we have to return to the moment of Constantine's conversion. And to do this, we have to again think more about Constantine's situation leading up to the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. So as I mentioned last time, he was fighting against an emperor who had fortified the city of Rome, built up huge supplies of food and water, and had defended the city against attacks by two other emperors in the past 7 years, simply by staying behind his walls and waiting them out. When Maxentius decided to march out of his walls and fight Constantine, any commander worth anything would know that this was completely uncharacteristic and represented something of a miracle. And if this miracle was preceded by a vision of a Christian cross and a sign of Christ was put on the standards before the battle, we can understand why Constantine or any reasonable person would think that the Christian God was real and powerful. So if we accept that Constantine's conversion is real, and I think we should, we're still faced with a very serious problem. Because we know that Constantine converts and issues a series of laws establishing toleration for Christians and restoring Christian property. But we also know that he remained attached to pagan gods and his official images, and even laws requiring certain traditional religious rites were issued by Constantine. So how can we put this together? How can Constantine legitimately have converted to Christianity but still continued to do pagan things? I think the answer is pretty natural, because Constantine, of course, was converting from paganism. And so Constantine's religious awareness came from this pagan environment where the gods generally are extremely tolerant of other people approaching other divine entities and other gods. And when Constantine converted to Christianity, who among the bishops was going to tell the emperor who had just stopped a persecution that even though he's Christian, he's behaving like a pagan? Especially when the empire is still 90% pagan, and it's quite likely that Constantine would then say, well, wait a second, I'm not convinced that Christianity is actually what I want to do. The other thing about this, though, is many of these Christian bishops who would have to tell Constantine that he was doing things that weren't exactly Christian were bishops who escaped death because of Constantine's conversion. And so they were so grateful to him that there was no way they're going to make any demands of him. Instead, they're going to let him go about his merry way, give direction when they can, but not press Constantine if he doesn't listen to them. And this is pretty much how it was for most of Constantine's reign. Now, by the 330s, it's true, there were some younger bishops with no direct experience of the persecution who began to push back. But this is really the exception. Older bishops in particular gave Constantine free rein because they were shocked and very, very pleased to have seen the empire shift from one that persecuted Christians into a state led by a Christian. But that gratitude didn't prevent them from thinking about what it would now mean that the state was led by a Christian. Although bishops really did not challenge Constantine, they began to imagine what the marriage of Christianity and imperial power could accomplish. And as Constantine aged, this imagination grew into a model of what a Christian empire could look like. So Eusebius' Life of Constantine that you read for this week is the most comprehensive blueprint for a Christian Roman Empire prepared in that time. And it's important to emphasize at the outset that this is a text that describes a lot of things that Constantine did, but its goal is not to describe Constantine as he was. Instead, the life of Constantine actually outlines how an ideal Christian leader was supposed to behave and what benefits he and the empire got when he lived up to those Christian standards. So this is, in a sense, another version of what Decius, Valerian, and Diocletian were doing. Those emperors were really trying to make the empire stronger by making its religious life work more efficiently. And they saw this efficiency coming from making more people sacrifice regularly. But Eusebius saw this efficiency coming instead from something different, from an empire that embraced a more powerful Christian God. And for him, it was in Christianity, not renewed paganism, that the empire could heal itself. And Constantine's career then is proof to Eusebius that the Christian God is more powerful, and a political system based around his service, based on service to him, will make the empire stronger. And Eusebius is an interesting person to take on this task. Eusebius was born in 260 AD in the city of Caesarea, the capital of the province of Palestine, and now a kind of hoity-toity suburb of Tel Aviv. He seems to have been born to a wealthy Christian family, and he grew up a Christian. And like many elites in this period, he was given an extensive literary education in Greek grammar, rhetoric, and philosophy. But he also received a special type of philosophical instruction, because beginning in the 230s, an Alexandrian Christian teacher operating Caesarea named Origen began teaching Christianity as a sort of philosophy. Now, Origen taught Greek philosophy as well, but he told his students that Greek philosophers really just prepared people to properly understand Christianity. And Eusebius was taught by one of Origen's students. And so he came of age as an intellectual Christian who thought deeply about Christianity and its larger meanings. Now, Eusebius lived for 40 years in the period of toleration between the persecution of Valerian and the beginning of the Great Persecution. And so from childhood until middle age, Eusebius had never seen the empire persecute Christians or really take much notice of them. He seems to have been genuinely shocked when in 303 the empire started again to persecute Christians. And when the Great Persecution broke out, it seems that Eusebius was only a mid-level member of the clergy, and so not important enough to attract attention from the persecutors. But by 310, he'd become a target, as the persecution swept up other, more senior members of the church hierarchy. He then fled his home and was arrested as a fugitive in Egypt. He returned following the end of the persecution in 311. He was made bishop of Caesarea in 315, and then he held that position until his death in 340. Now, as many intellectuals try to do, Eusebius worked to try to make sense of what was going on in the world around him, and he was an extremely prolific author. So he wrote a series of theological works, a work called The Preparation for the Gospels, that was designed to get people ready to train to become Christians in the kind of sense that Eusebius himself was, a kind of philosophical Christian. He also wrote something called The Demonstration of the Gospels. And this is a work that explains that the Gospels had superior content and superior wisdom to pagan thought. But more relevant to us were the histories that he wrote. And these were projects that he apparently began at the outset of the persecutions, and there are 3 of them. 2 of them were ultimately combined. So he wrote an extended account of the Christian martyrs who were killed by Roman officials in Palestine. He also wrote a chronicle, the first such work of its kind. And in the chronicle, Eusebius developed an idea that would shape the way that time was understood and organized for much of the next 1,000 years. Most texts like that chronicle have been organized around yearly lists of events that started with the foundation of a city and then briefly described the major events that happened each year since that foundation. But what Eusebius did was to Christianize this, because his chronicle started not with the foundation of a city, it started with Adam and Eve, the foundation of humanity, and worked up to the present. Now this is a subtle change, but it's an important one, because what Eusebius was doing was marking all of history as Christian history. So the world was not made up of a set of cities, each of which had their own history. It now only had one history, and that history was a Christian one. And all of these cities ultimately figured into that larger idea of history. And he took this approach even further with a third, much longer work. This was his Ecclesiastical History, a book that charted the history of the Christian church from the time of Christ all the way up to the present day. Unlike the Chronicle, which had a couple paragraphs at most per year, the Ecclesiastical History contained a long narrative that culminated in the triumph of the church. But what's odd about this is that Eusebius began this project before he knew that the church would triumph. And then he seems to have added on a 9th book in which he celebrates the conversion of Constantine and the great relief that this brought to Christians. But despite this, it's important to remember that Eusebius actually didn't live under Constantine for the first 11 years that the emperor was a Christian. Eusebius lived in the east, and Constantine didn't conquer the eastern part of the empire until he defeated Licinius in 324. And so until that point, Eusebius didn't actually know very much about Constantine. And so his image of Constantine was then based more on rumors than actual fact. And this is why the Ecclesiastical History has this odd quality, where it ends with a sort of vague sigh of relief. But after 324, Eusebius got to know Constantine better. They weren't close, But it seems that Eusebius met the emperor a few times and began writing things that publicly praised Constantine. And one of the most famous of these was an oration in praise of Constantine that Eusebius delivered in 335 or 336 at the celebration of the 30th anniversary of Constantine's reign. This was his first attempt at suggesting what he thought a Christian emperor should look like. And in it, Eusebius basically suggests how emperors should behave by praising the elements of Constantine's life that exemplified these ideal behaviors. Now, the origin only led up to the life of Constantine, the last major project that Eusebius worked on before his death in either 339 or 340. And the life of Constantine takes the same basic approach as the oration in praise of Constantine, but it's a far more sophisticated and complicated text. So it was begun just after the death of Constantine in 337, and that means that it's shaped more with an eye towards what Eusebius wanted the world to become after Constantine than it is by a desire to actually tell us about the person Constantine and what he actually did. So basically, Eusebius is trying to make two arguments at once in the text. First, he's saying that God greatly rewards emperors who are pious Christians, and he punishes those who are not. And then second, he wants to make the case that the way to rule as a pious Christian emperor has changed now that the persecution has ended. The pious Christian emperor now can't simply just end persecution. He also has to favor the church legally and crack down on paganism. And Eusebius's Constantine embodies all of these Christian virtues, even if the real Constantine didn't do so to quite the degree that Eusebius must have thought was ideal. Now, these are the big points that Eusebius is arguing, but it's interesting to trace how he develops them. So the biography starts as you would expect, by focusing on Constantine's family. But instead of giving us an accurate portrait of Constantine's family, which was, after all, pretty remarkable, given that he was the son of an emperor, Eusebius instead gives us a sort of pious Christian fiction. It does seem that, as Eusebius claims, Constantine's mother Helena was a Christian, but Constantine's father Constantius certainly was not a Christian. In making things harder for Eusebius, Constantius divorced Helena in 293 when he was made part of the Tetrarchy, and he remarried to a daughter of the Emperor Maximian, and he had a new family with her. Now, the sons he had by the second wife were Constantius's real legal heirs, and that's actually, one of them is the Emperor Julian's father. But Eusebius says nothing about them. Instead, Eusebius gives Constantius a very different character. He was a Christian emperor of the best type that the historical moment allowed. And so Eusebius gives us this image of Constantius. During the whole course of his quiet and peaceful reign, he dedicated his entire household, his children, his wife, and his domestic attendants to the one supreme God, so that the company assembled within the walls of his palace differed in no respect from a church of God, wherein there were also to be found his ministers who continually offered supplications on behalf of their prince, and this at a time when, with most, it was not allowable to have any dealings with the worshippers of God, even so far as to exchange a word with them. And so what we see is that Constantius in Eusebius's portrait is framed as a pious Christian ruler whose entire court is made up basically of Christians. But the issue for this is there's no evidence outside of Eusebius to support this. What we see, of course, is something like this. Constantius put Sol Invictus on his coins. There's no indication outside of Eusebius that Constantius was ever anything but a pagan. Now, there is also, to be fair, no real evidence that Constantius ever persecuted Christians. This is certainly true as well. But the area of the empire that Constantius was in charge of didn't have many Christians. And so it's possible that he chose not to persecute Christians. That's certainly possible. It's also possible, of course, that he didn't persecute Christians because none came to his attention. And so it wasn't actually a matter of any importance to him at all. And so what Eusebius has done here is that he has exploited the lack of evidence of any persecution by Constantius to give us an image of Constantius that doesn't actually really hold up. But in Eusebius's text, it's important to have Constantius look this way, because what he wants to see is that the Christian faith that Constantius possesses brings him a great reward. And so what Eusebius says is that, all of the emperors who had persecuted suffered either terrible deaths or few children were born to them. And Eusebius tries to convince his audience that Constantius's faith in God brought him a special set of rewards. So from that time on, Constantius was named Chief Augustus of the four who were afterwards elected to that honor. Moreover, he surpassed most of the emperors in regard to the number of his family, having gathered around him a very large circle of children, both male and female. And lastly, when he had attained to a happy old age and was about to pay the common debt of nature and exchange this life for another, God once more manifested his power in a special manner on his behalf, by providing that his eldest son, Constantine, should be present during his last moments and ready to receive imperial power from his hands. And so in this, Eusebius is giving his first evidence to support his theory that imperial power works alongside Christianity to ensure the success of an emperor. And this is a theory that he actually spelled out a little bit earlier in the text. He said, having given assurance that those who glorify and honor him will meet with an abundant reward from him, while those who set themselves against him as enemies will bring ruin on their own souls, God has already established the truth of these things, his own declarations. Because he's shown the fearful end of those tyrants who denied and opposed him, but one who lives a godly life justly claims an immortal monument. And so what Eusebius is saying here is what he will prove beginning with the discussion of Constantius. Constantius lived a godly life in accordance with the teachings of the Christian God, and the reward was a large family, lots of children, and the blessing of God showing itself in a very particular way by having his son Constantine take over and take imperial power from him. Now, this idea that God rewards the Christian sovereigns and he punishes those who deny and oppose him, this is a guiding principle for the rest of the book. And Constantine, as the ultimate Christian ruler, will receive these divine and human rewards while his opponents will be punished. So we saw last time how Eusebius uses Constantine's victory over Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge to show this. But the same basic story is repeated throughout books 1 and 2. It becomes almost something of a stock narrative. So the emperors against whom Constantine fought were attacked not because Constantine was the aggressor, but because they plotted against him. Now, the reality about this is a lot more tricky. Some of the people that Constantine fought against and led to or ordered the execution of did actually intrigue against him. Others, it's more complicated. Licinius, for example, who Constantine defeated in 324, kind of fits in both categories. But what Eusebius wants to do is present you with a picture where this is a kind of standard thing. So, for example, in Book 1, Chapter 57, Eusebius talks about the campaign that Constantine launches against the Emperor Maximinus Daia. A campaign that actually Constantine didn't fight, Licinius fought. Maximinus Daia probably did conspire against Constantine, and he absolutely did persecute Christians, and so he does sort of fit the criteria, but he wasn't defeated by Constantine. He was defeated by Licinius, and the persecutions stopped because of Licinius. But this reality complicates the ideal that Eusebius is putting out there. And the case against Licinius that Eusebius makes in the ecclesiastical history, the work that precedes the life of Constantine, shows how complicated this actually was. Because following the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Licinius and Constantine are actually allies who seal their alliance to each other by arranging a marriage that joined Licinius and Constantine's sister. And so when Eusebius wrote the ecclesiastical history, he actually put Licinius alongside Constantine as a pious sovereign on whom God bestowed rewards. And so he says this: the impious ones having thus been removed, the government was preserved firm and undisputed for Constantine and Licinius, to whom it fittingly belonged, because they, having first of all cleaned the world of hostility to the divine being, conscious of the benefits which he'd conferred upon them, showed their love of virtue and of God, and their piety and gratitude to the deity by their ordinance on behalf of the Christians. And so in the ecclesiastical history, Constantine and Licinius are a pair of Christian emperors. And this is, of course, written at a time when the two emperors are allies. But by the time of the life of Constantine, Licinius has become a very different sort of person in Eusebius's text. Licinius now is somebody who plots against Constantine. Though in fairness, Constantine probably started at least one and maybe both of the two wars that he fought against Licinius. But even more astonishing was Eusebius's claim that Licinius began a secret persecution of Christians in Book 2. And so he tells us that Licinius continued to rush headlong towards that destruction which awaits the enemies of God. And once more, with a fatal emulation of their example, whose ruin he had himself witnessed as the consequence of their impious conduct, he rekindled the persecution of the Christians like a long extinguished fire, and fanned the unhallowed flame to a fiercer height than any who had gone before him. And Eusebius then continues by saying that Licinius tore down churches and attacked bishops because he too was conscious of his own crimes to expect that these services were performed with any view to his own benefit. And he was convinced that all we did and all our endeavors to obtain the favor of God were actually done on Constantine's behalf. Now there's a problem with this. Not only does the life of Constantine contradict what's said in the ecclesiastical history, but there's actually no evidence that Licinius did any of these things. It is plausible that he did attack some people he thought were supporters of Constantine who lived in the East, but we don't actually have any evidence for this outside of what Eusebius says, and we certainly don't have any evidence that this was a Christian persecution as opposed to a political persecution of anyone supporting his rival. But Eusebius needed this narrative to be true, because Eusebius wants it to be clear that all of Constantine's enemies in civil wars are emperors who conspired both against Constantine and against Christianity. And so the military narrative then is designed to prove Eusebius's first major point, that God rewards emperors who are Christian and punishes those who act against Christianity. So now I want to move to the second part of the project that Eusebius develops in the life of Constantine. Since he's convinced you that God rewards Christian emperors who govern according to God's wishes, Eusebius now wants to take the opportunity to explain how exactly an emperor should govern according to the wishes of God. And this is a revolutionary step, because other Christians writing during Constantine's life had made the point that God rewards Christian emperors and punishes persecutors. So this was a case made by the Latin author Lactantius and also by Eusebius in the ecclesiastical history. But Christians had not really given any thought to what a Christian emperor actually should do once persecutions ended. For centuries, they vaguely thought that an emperor would tolerate Christianity right before the world ended, but most Christians most of the time were told to focus not on the Roman Empire, but on a kind of empire of God that would come at the end of times. So Eusebius then is making up a sort of manifesto for a Christian Roman Empire that no Christian had ever really thought would exist. And so this was an exercise in imagination that had no real precedence. And so Eusebius argues that the nature of this Christian Roman emperor was shown by the career of Constantine. But this is again another exercise in interpretation. And here too, Eusebius is again being very selective in presenting his view of what Constantine did and why he did it. So, for example, Eusebius details a number of legal actions that Constantine took to support the Christian church. So he called and attended church councils. He restored church property that was seized in the Great Persecution. He issued laws making the church the legal heir to all land that belonged to the martyrs, not given in a will to somebody else. Cemeteries and tombs of the martyrs were given to the church, and Constantine built major churches. Now, all of these things are natural things for a Christian emperor to do, and Constantine did actually do all of them. There are laws in the books that show Constantine ordering many of these very things. So in this sense, it seems that Constantine would have agreed with Eusebius that a Christian sovereign should do all of these things to support the church and its growth. But where Eusebius makes a really dramatic shift is in his attitude towards paganism. Though it's hard to imagine this now, the creation of a Christian empire need not also have meant the destruction of paganism. So if we think about the US now, the country is overwhelmingly Christian. More than 75% of the people are Christian, at least self-identify as Christian in the United States. But other religions exist and are practiced without problems, and if you drive through any major city, you see a whole host of different churches, synagogues, mosques, temples. And this shows us that it's perfectly plausible for Christianity to thrive while other religions do as well. So it's by no means essential or even natural for the first Christian emperor to decide that his empire needed to use the force of the state to suppress paganism. Constantine, for his part, simply made it clear that he favored a Christian God and encouraged others to do so as well. But Eusebius's Constantine took a different view of this than the real Constantine. Eusebius's Constantine did these things. He issued a law against sacrifice. He condemned idolatry. He tore down temples. Now, these are some of the big initiatives against paganism that Eusebius's Constantine undertook. And Eusebius doesn't actually lie here. Constantine did do all of these things, but we need to contextualize these actions. So Constantine did issue a law against sacrifice, but it's a law only in the most technical sense. It consisted of an imperial letter, and all imperial letters had the force of law. And that letter was written to cities and explained that Constantine did not approve of sacrifice. That law contained no penalties. No one was ever prosecuted under it. It was never enforced, and in fact, it never could be enforced because there was nothing to enforce. It was just the emperor expressing his preference, which has legal standing, but isn't actionable as a legal, as an actual law. And in fact, later pagans didn't even know that this was a law at all. So this is a pagan writing in the 380s, and he said Constantine made absolutely no changes in the traditional form of worship, meaning that both are true. Eusebius is right. Constantine did issue a law saying no sacrifices. And Libanius is also right. Constantine made no changes in the traditional form of worship because Constantine's law made no changes. It just stated his preference. A similar thing is true of the condemnation of idolatry. This too was an empty statement that showed that the emperor did not like people praying to idols. But he also was not inclined to do anything about it. And so he did say this. But he didn't persecute or attack or legally penalize anybody for praying to idols. Now finally and most problematically is the statement that Constantine tore down temples. Again, he may have. We never hear about 3 of these temples before or after the reign of Constantine, so we don't actually know what happened there. But the 4th temple, the temple of Asclepius at Aigai, we do know quite a bit about, and pagans were genuinely upset about it being destroyed. But when we hear pagans talk about it, they blame Constantine's son, not Constantine, for its destruction. And so we also need to put these temple destructions in some kind of context. Did Constantine do something to that temple? It seems like maybe he did. Did he tear down the entire temple? It seems for sure he did not, because that temple is still working and functional in the 350s, long after Constantine had died. But the other thing is, 4 temples in an empire the size of the Roman Empire is nothing. The city of Alexandria alone had 2,500 temples in it at the start of the reign of Constantine, and that's just one city among thousands in the empire. So we're probably talking about perhaps 1 million temples and shrines at least that are active in the Roman Empire at the time of Constantine's conversion. And he destroyed 4. So this is not programmatic. It's not even really particularly descriptive. It's descriptive of a few actions that Constantine probably took, but it overemphasizes this dramatically. And the reason that Eusebius overemphasizes these things is because Eusebius is using Constantine to lay out a vision for how the Christian empire Constantine initiated should function in the future. So the actions belong to a Constantine who actually existed, but the motivations that Eusebius ascribes to him do not. And the significance of these actions are overstated dramatically. But Eusebius manages to pull off a really difficult task here, because the actions taken by his Constantine were real, and the rewards God supposedly bestowed on him are clear. The audience is willing to accept that Eusebius is accurately portraying the emperor. This meant that even in the 4th century, people brought in to Eusebius's view of Constantine, and by extension his vision for a Christian empire in which paganism was suppressed, are brought in by the text. they're not brought in by a detailed study of what Constantine actually did, because these things are not actually the goal of Constantine the man, but they're very much the goal of Constantine's biographer, and because of that, the biographer, telling the story of Constantine, ascribes these motivations to his subject and explains these actions in a way that charts what he hopes will point to a future Christian Roman Empire.